Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 27 of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me, as always, is Z. So we're just going to jump right into some topics. So a while ago, I think before the summer break on the podcast, we talked about some security researchers who were arrested in Iowa. They were part of a team called Coalfire. So they were doing a pen test. I think it was on a courthouse, right, that we were talking about it?
Yeah, it would involved a bit more than just the courthouse. Yeah, we talked about in episode 18, actually. So it was after we got back from the break.
Oh, I thought
the initial
okay.
stuff happened while we were off. And then we had a little bit of an update on episode 18, which is where we actually covered it.
Okay. Yeah, I meant to go back and get the exact episode number, but I forgot to, so that's cool that you got that for me. But yeah, so they broke, I think it was, they broke into the courthouse, and then there was something with the alarm. They weren't supposed to disable the alarm, I think.
Well, so
As
there
part of
were, the scoping
court order?
document, as we talked about last time, was a little bit conflicting. One of the things, was that they weren't, so the other thing was they weren't supposed to force any locks.
Right,
And then they had potentially picked one of the side doors. Then there were questions about the hours, whether or not they were supposed to be operating like in the evening or only business hours or only some specific hours. There's a little lack of clarity, or where one part of the scoping document said one thing, another part said another. The gist of it, though, is these two guys believed they were operating, within scope, and ended up tripping an alarm. Had the police come, they were arrested. The police didn't care that they had some authority to actually be performing an assessment, and there's a bit of a dispute between I want to say it was the local and the state.
Yeah.
Or whoever approved the testing in the state, they had a disagreement over whether or not they should have been doing any of this sort of assessment or any of this sort of testing at all without their approval.
Yeah. So I think we were both in agreement that these guys shouldn't have been charged when we summed it up, right?
Correct. I mean, they believe that they were operating with permission. I mean, while ignorance of the law isn't a defense, in some cases, intent is required for a lot of crimes. So in this case, I mean, what ended up happening, though, was that the charges were reduced down to just trespassing, which doesn't require that same level of intent. And we kind of talked about that and how the prosecutor just dropped it to the minimal thing. So it's well, we're still charging them with something. Anyway, kind of the update here is those charges have kind of been fully dropped now.
Yeah, which is awesome. Yeah, I mean, obviously there was a communication breakdown between the state and the local government, and it was kind of ridiculous to try to pin that on the pen testers. And like you were saying, it kind of seemed scummy that they were trying to pin them with anything they could, and that's why they dropped the charge. That was,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely... It could definitely have had a chilling effect if it went through, just in terms of seeing any sort of assessment going on with government, because the gist of it ended up being that, the state government, and I'm sorry, I only had planned to mention, they dropped in, we were going to move on, but what I remember it being is basically the state government approved the testing on the state courthouse, but because it's the local county also either used it or obviously kind of owns the property, it's on their land, so they should have need to be involved with it. So it's basically saying okay, so they should have had approval from every county that they wanted to test, and that just seems a bit excessive for the state to be testing the state courthouses.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a quick recap just because it has been quite a while. So
all right, you might have
I wanted to go back to that
more update information than I remember.
I do remember seeing some people pushing for them to give a talk at DEF CON this year related to the whole incident. I don't know if they've said that they're going to or not, but that'd be pretty fun to look out for if they do plan on doing that. I'd probably check out that talk if I go to DEF CON this year, which I probably will. But yeah, so we'll keep pushing for them to do a talk, because I think that would be a cool talk. But yeah,
I don't know. I mean, they got arrested. What are we expecting them to talk about in particular?
We only got some details on the scope of the pen test, right? We didn't get a lot of the the details of what they were actually like.
I
just feel
mean,
like
they
they
were
could give
doing
more
an
information on the
assessment, though. I
assignment
mean,
or the
if we,
assessment.
there are a lot of people that talk about physical assessment, so I
Okay.
don't see why it would need to be them. Like, the only unique thing here is they were arrested. But then I'd want to hear more from the lawyers, or I guess EFF wasn't involved on this one, but like I'd want to hear more on that side, perhaps. But that
Which you
wouldn't
wouldn't get
be,
at the talk. Yeah.
which wouldn't be the two guys.
Yeah.
We just had a quick question in chat from Sledgington. What method was used to get in? I believe in this case it was basically lockpicking was used to get in. It talks about them, or in their scope, they weren't supposed to force any lock, so you can debate over whether or not lockpicking is actually forcing versus, breaking in a lock as being forcing. But I believe it was just pick the outside lock to get into the building.
Yeah.
Which ended up tripping the alarm, and obviously the police ended up coming.
So just a quick update. The next piece of news we have was Avast. This was pretty big. There was a lot of controversy around Avast in the past week.
And it's actually also something we talked about on episode 21, or related to what we talked about on EP 21.
Yeah. So Avast, they got caught with, they were basically mass data collecting on all of their customers that were using I think it was their web safety product, or was it all of them?
Well, so this starts off, if we go back to episode 21, back on the 28th of October, the creator of AdBlock Plus had looked into the Avast web safety extension and noticed that, okay, that extension's spying on everybody. It's sending like everything you're doing off to Avast, your not just what websites you're visiting, it's including like how many windows you have open, how many tabs you've got open, your tab ID for whatever window you're active on. It's including a lot of information. And that ended up resulting, as we talked about before, about Mozilla and Opera removing the Avast extension from their web stores because of all of this data collection. At the time, Google hadn't had any response. They also removed it. And then in mid-December, Avast apparently made some changes. The extension was approved and allowed back out on, as far as I'm aware, all of the platforms. And they kind of put out a statement to some individual news agencies saying, privacy is our top priority, and the discussion about what is best practice in dealing with data is an ongoing one in the tech industry. We have never compromised on the security or privacy of personal data. We're listening to our users and acknowledging we need to be more transparent with our users about what data is necessary for our security products to work, and give them a choice in whether they wish to share their data and for what purposes. So, I mean, sounds like corporate speak.
Yeah.
The end result of that, like with that statement, what they changed to was they started collecting data from the antivirus itself.
Right.
And they added an opt-in button. It would give you this little alert asking if you want to opt in to having your data collected. And obviously, if you opted in, your data became available as part of this Jumpshot system. And Jumpshot was something that was just kind of mentioned on the side back in that original bit where, and hey, we see the extension collecting all this information, and there's this company Avast owns, or a subsidiary of Avast, that called Jumpshot, and they sell all this clickstream data. Then kind of what happened this week, finally, is there's a joint investigation by Vice and PC Magazine, where they ended up getting some documents from Jumpshot to kind of indicate more information about what was being sold. And it essentially just confirmed exactly what we expected. That Avast was collecting that information from their extension users, now from their antivirus users, selling it off to big name companies. Talks a bit about the different types of sales they have, like no click info, just knowing like what the top domains access were versus getting like click feeds on a specific domain. In theory, it's all supposed to be anonymized, and you shouldn't be able to pull out any identifying information, but there are contracts that did include device IDs that were hashed that could be used to connect and get connect multiple visits together, which is something their normal sale didn't include. So basically, right after, Avast is telling us, oh yeah, we care about your privacy, we kind of get information to just confirming they really don't. So a few days later, so this was on the 27th, I believe, when the Motherboard or Vice and PC Magazine put out their articles. And then on the 30th, Avast is shutting down the Jumpshot company completely.
So yeah, what made it so egregious was the fact that not only were they collecting the data, but they were also selling the data. Some of those clients, by the way, I did just want to touch on this. Is you were saying some big name clients, but like some of those clients included Google, Yelp, Microsoft, Pepsi, some pretty big brands, and I thought it pretty interesting that Google was included in that list because if I remember right, back when the Avast extension was being talked about, when we talked about it in episode 21, I think you said it was. I think Chrome was like one of the last ones to actually remove it, and I think Firefox removed it, and then Chrome didn't remove it for like another day or two, and people were kind of wondering if they were going to remove it.
Well, I'm not even sure if Chrome had removed it by the time we did our episode.
They might not have. Yeah, I think they were pretty late on it.
But that said, I believe there has also been denial from Google on that. So whether or not they were, and I don't have a source for that. It's just something I do recall kind of reading that there was at least some denial from Google that they were actually paying for that information. And to some extent, it makes sense because Google's already going to have quite a bit of information.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. But it just raises that interesting, potential conflict of interest there of like, Google manages the extent.
Because some of the things
manages the extensions, and if these extensions are able to sell your data back to Google, that that's a pretty noteworthy connection.
Oh, I mean, we don't know what type of information. Let's say Google was a client. We don't know what type sale they had there. Because I mean, I'm sure a lot of their big name clients are. Actually, it's even mentioned in the Vice report that, like financial institutions would just pay for the top 10,000 domains, just know kind of what type trends are out there, what websites are kind of growing in use or dying in use. Not really privacy destroying information.
Okay.
So, I mean, Google could have been doing something like that too. But, I mean, again, I feel like they'd have a lot of this information. So, I don't know. I'm not taking the whole list of clients too seriously.
Yeah, just because
I mean, it's definitely possible, but because there's so many options, I don't want to, start making any sort of claim about any of these companies being like, oh, well, they're just terrible companies for buying this when what they purchased may not have really been all that bad. That said, I mean, on the Avast side, to have come out with a statement about how much they care about privacy, to then come out and, have it realized that...
Just corporate trouble,
yeah, they basically just moved it from the extension to their free antivirus.
It's really shitty that like these antivirus companies that are supposed to be protecting your data and your security are abusing their customer bases like this.
Yeah, well, the thing is, like, I'd also kind of pull in just the comment from the CEO, where this is kind of on a vast thing, but the bottom line is that any practices that jeopardize user trust are unacceptable to Avast. We are vigilant about our users' privacy, and we took quick action to begin winding down Jumpshot's operations.
Once we got caught.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually what it goes on to say. After it became evident that some users questioned the alignment of data provision to Jumpshot with our mission and principles.
So yeah, it basically is exactly that. We didn't think users would care. We didn't think this was that bad until
we didn't think anybody would find out. Is I think more of it. I mean,
that's definitely what they were actually thinking. But what they're trying to spin it into is like, we didn't think it was that bad until people pointed it out. Oh, okay, you guys don't want this. Okay, we're gonna be very nice people and not do the thing you don't want us to do.
Yeah,
it's just core classic PR.
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad for the people that are working at Jumpshot. I mean, 'cause as far as I know, they're just being laid off.
Yeah.
Like they're, just a bunch of
Sucks.
people have simply lost their jobs at this point. There's no.
And it's probably one of those companies where I don't even know if you'd want to have it on your resume just because of how much of a controversy there is around it.
Oh,
right?
I don't think that'll be
Like,
all that much of an issue. A
you don't
job's a
think so?
job.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, unless you're, generally speaking, like even, you've got like Pornhub or something, which, okay, so you can understand, some more religious organizations maybe not wanting that, but generally speaking, companies, unless it's a recognizable name, they're all pretty much equal.
Okay. I just feel like if I was like personally working at Jumpshot, trying to put myself in those shoes, and then I went
Well,
to go
you
try
also
to
made
work
the
for another
choice to
place.
work there, so whatever. But I don't think it's going to hurt too many people.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, definitely this should be kind of a big red flag for Avast. I think it's on that blacklist. I don't think anybody should use it. Hopefully nobody's using it anymore, but they're probably, there's probably still people out there using it.
That was something I was kind of thinking about with this. Is just there's a bit of the bad apple spoils the bunch, because yes, okay, this is specific to Avast, and obviously neither of us are in support of this, but at the same time, it's going to start making people just question in general all data collection from all applications, and other things have done that too. But I mean, there are legitimate cases for collecting not all of this information, like not, they should be collecting like your entire browser setup and everything, but there are applications that, like crash reports and stuff are useful things, and people will, of course, seek any data collections, just start opting out of it by habit, and that includes the things that are actually useful.
I mean, to support that kind of is one thing that I saw a lot of people saying on Reddit and other social media around this story was this is one reason why nobody should use antiviruses. We don't need antiviruses anymore. They're just gonna all start doing this kind of stuff, and this kind of ties back to what you're saying with bad apple spoils the bunch. I think that's a pretty bad take. We've talked about this a bit before, I think, but antiviruses still absolutely have a place. Some of them, like Avast, are kind of probably shouldn't be used. But there are good ones out there, and I don't think we should just say throw antiviruses out completely. And it's unfortunate that people are starting to think that way because of situations like this. But yeah, like generally, don't throw out antiviruses. They're still useful. They're still useful for protecting some of those against some of those, mass campaign.
I mean, it's just another
attacks.
layer that you kind of need there. Like, yes, I mean, it's easy enough to, if you're being targeted, it's easy enough to have or to build, malware that's not going to get detected. It's not all that difficult. I mean, you can pretty much go on hack forums and pay somebody a couple dollars to do it. Anyhow, you can do it yourself too. But if you don't even want to go that route, you can take some known malware, pay a couple dollars, get it made undetectable, and you're done. That said, that type of system just doesn't really work when, a lot of malware campaigns are going to be targeting thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. They're just kind of sending it out in mass, what was it? Malvertising, for example, is just sending out en masse. That's where your antivirus is going to help you out. If you end up falling victim to one of those campaigns where they're already seeing it, they're hopefully, if you're not one of the first people, they're probably already aware of it. And you're kind of getting that little bit of protection at that point. It's just a layer of defense, and there are some more active protections too that law firm will offer, but it's just a layer of defense. Obviously, having an ad blocker in there, then you don't have to worry about the malicious ad campaigns would be, another layer. But I mean, I understand where people come from when they're saying, like, just get rid of the antivirus. Like, I know enough not to click on any suspicious links or whatever, and it's totally true. Especially among our listeners, most of you are probably well aware of what a suspicious link looks like, and you're not just downloading your I don't really keep up with movies, but whatever the latest movie is .exe because you want to watch it. But I mean, it has its place. We've discussed it on a previous episode. I don't know what number. I think it was just kind of a side discussion.
Yeah, I think it was as well. But yeah, like the other thing they're useful for too is like that post intrusion detection, right? That can be useful too. So yeah, don't throw AVs out, but Avast is definitely one that probably should be on the blacklist for everyone going forward. They can say they care about user security all they want, but
Yeah, I mean, at this point, they've
their
completely
actions speak
lost
louder than
any.
words.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, they've lost any trust I had, and I have used the Avast. I did use them for a little while.
Not going
And
to
I
be
mean,
using them anymore though.
well, yeah, I mean, I've found Windows Defender to be generally sufficient.
Yeah,
it's definitely not the best. Like, if you can look at the benchmarks, like there are better options, but I mean, it's not like Defender is just completely useless either. And at least Windows, they're already collecting information on me. So
I think actually, I mean, this is obviously a side discussion. We're getting a little bit off topic, but I think recently in a recent Windows update, they actually did introduce some newer, better options for disabling some of that telemetry. I just wanted to add that in there.
okay,
I think they do
familiar.
have some more options to disable more of it now. Maybe not all of it, but a little bit more of it. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But yeah.
Yeah, well, like I said, though, like some of the telemetry I do think makes sense. Especially, at the operating system level. Again, obviously, Microsoft also gives you like your advertiser ID and things like that, which kind of defeat any sort of privacy. But at the same time, there are reasons to collect information.
So shedding a bit more of a positive light on Google, we have Say Hello to OpenSK, a fully open source security key implementation. So in recent years, there's been a strong push to strengthen two-factor authentication, especially because a lot of it relies on SMS, and we know how weak that can be, especially to like phishing attacks and stuff like that. It's not
well,
great.
SIM jacking is kind of the big thing right now.
Yeah, SIM jacking as well. So,
I mean, your phishing attacks, I mean, you're going to be vulnerable to that even with token-based stuff, regardless of it being just on your device. I mean, if somebody phishes or social engineers you into giving up your token, so at least the hardware does a little bit better at that. I'll let you carry on.
Yeah. So, this push for 2FA and some other types of authentication like passwordless authentication spawned the creation of the FIDO Alliance, which I think FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online. That wasn't mentioned in the article. I had to go digging for that. But yeah, so they try to set some better authentication standards to help with passwords, and passwords are another thing that they're not a great system just because it's very common for people to reuse passwords. The best way to manage passwords is probably password manager, and there's even some issues with that. So passwordless authentication is pretty cool. So FIDO tries to push systems that can kind of get around these problems. So you can use it as multi-factor authentication, or like the devices that FIDO tries to push, you can use as like multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, passwordless auth. And they have like various different avenues to do that with, right? Security key, biometrics, stuff like that.
I mean, essentially, FIDO is it's a set of protocols.
It's a set of
That's essentially what it is. And what Google's done here is they've open source, or OpenSK is an open source implementation of a FIDO2 authenticator. Built in Rust, runs on Talk OS, yep. Which is kind of like an embedded, low memory, low power OS for like microcontrollers. So basically what you would expect for like a 2FA dongle.
Yeah. So you can basically use this open source authenticator they've released to make your own developer key by flashing the firmware on a Nordic chip dongle, and they even include a 3D print schematic for the case. So they note, it's functional, obviously it works, but it shouldn't really be used in production. It's more for testing and research. But I will say, like, overall, I think this is really cool. Just because security keys in general, usually they're pretty closed source by nature. I can't really think of any.
They mention it in here, there's Solo, which is kind of the first open source Solo key, which is the first one there.
I don't remember that. Okay.
Yeah, it's in the first paragraph, following other open source projects like Solo and Somu to announce the release of OpenSK.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know how I skipped over that, but Okay, so I guess
which is
it's
kind
not
of another
totally
option.
new for that.
Although, at least with Solo, you can kind of buy the key to use, or they sell more of a developer focus. Or
Okay.
developer folks one that would be equivalent to what Google's kind of released here. Because I mean, this Nordic chip is like you can just go buy that for $10. It's not custom to Google or anything.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty cool because I think it'll be an interesting avenue for researchers to explore. You know, try go in there, start looking for flaws in the protocol and stuff like that. I think overall, I think it's pretty cool. I don't know what
It's a good move. I mean, I like seeing Rust there. I mean, we've memed Rust a bit, but it's still one of those things that's nice to see newer projects being adopted in more secure languages than just C, especially when it's being used on this sort of low power embedded device somewhere that C is, kind of the de facto choice. So seeing Rust being used, I mean, it's definitely going to be a positive move. You're getting some of that inherent security from using a safer language. But you're also ending up with, I don't know. I mean, it's just the fact that it's Rust, I think, is the most interesting aspect here. Am I going to go out and be using this or anything? Like, no, I'm not going to go and buy the Nordic dongle or anything I can flash and stuff. But I mean, it is nice that it's there for others to use. Said they're not the first ones. Google has a history of killing projects, but it's open source, so I mean that doesn't matter.
I was about to say one question I have is I wonder how active this project's actually going to be, if people are actually going to take interest in it, or if it's just going to kind of die.
Well, it's already fairly niche.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it more, like, I do think it's cool. It's a good step, but more I think about it, I think over time this is just going to kind of be forgotten.
Perhaps. I mean, it depends on whether or not Google dog feeds it. If Google starts using this internally and using that key, then they have kind of the incentive to keep developing it. But at the same time, it implements 502 standards. That's done. How you don't really have feature creep that's going to be coming into this. It's done.
It's more just for research and stuff. Yeah. So. But, I think it's cool. Overall, pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to see open source coming out from Google, too. I mean, obviously, they have other open source projects. And we've talked about some of their other open hardware coming out, too. Like, I'm definitely not complaining about it. I'm not terribly excited, but it is nice, like I said, to see the Rust getting used at this level.
Yeah. So speaking of hardware authentication, there was an article put out on by Kraken talking about a critical flaw they found in Trezor hardware wallets. I think it's Trezor, that's how you say it. And essentially, what this attack comes down to in this article is voltage glitching. It's a two-stage fault injection attack. So they talk about a little bit about how the wallet works and doing some reverse engineering on that. And basically, their two-stage fault injection attack, as kind of an overview, is the first one, post-boot, they re-enable the integrated bootloader, which has the capability to read out the flash contents of memory, which you can imagine why that would be kind of in the interest of an attacker when you're attacking a hardware wallet.
Yeah, I guess should mention here, like, they're attacking the hardware wallet, and what they're doing is they're able to extract the encrypted seed being used for it.
Yeah.
Just like the overview, the big picture of what's going on. That's what they're trying to get here.
Yeah. So they say that they could do it with like 15 minutes of access to the device, I think. So yeah, the first one re-enables that integrated bootloader. The second one bypasses a protection level check. So that allows you to read out the flash contents of the device.
Not really bypasses it exactly. They downgrade it. So you've got the read protection values being stored. And you've got kind of the three different levels of that, either no SRAM and flash access as kind of the highest level, level 2. You get SRAM access but no flash access at level 1, and then full access at level 0. So the chip's already set at kind of that level 2, the highest security, and they use the glitching to downgrade to the read protection 1, which gives them SRAM access, which also happens to be where all the crypto library stuff will go ahead and load their sensitive information into SRAM for actual computation, because this device doesn't actually have like a secure enclave to store anything or any sort of crypto chip or anything like that. So it needs to use the SRAM for that. That's effectively the only place it could store it.
Yeah. So obviously, because this is a hardware attack, existing wallets are always going to be vulnerable to this. But obviously, they did report it. I think the manufacturer did acknowledge it. So I don't know if going forward they're going to use something like a secure enclave, like what you were talking about with their future wallets. But yeah, it's always fun to see like glitching attacks and stuff like that, because mainly being a software person, hardware stuff is always like dark magic.
It's worth noting what they pull out is, like I said, the encrypted pin, or not the encrypted pin, the encrypted state. From there, it is encrypted. So one of the defenses on this is use a passphrase, which you can enable. You can have a passphrase. Suddenly, you can't brute force the decryption key. You still could brute force, but it'll take longer if you set a secure key. So, that's the mitigation here. That said, by default, it's just a pin. So you can brute force the pin pretty easily. And so, generally speaking, it's considered, if you get physical access to a device, it's game over. I think that's kind of true here, but there are definitely some clear steps that they could have taken. As we've already mentioned, they're using some sort of crypto chip, having somewhere for those calculations to be performed, instead of just having kind of like a single permission layer, which is what they have now.
Especially for something like a crypto wallet, though, I think physical attack should definitely be considered in the threat model. So I think it's fair to, like you were saying, like physical access to the device usually means game over, but in this case, I think it is definitely fair that they should, try to make it so that isn't the case. Just because of the nature of the
there's
device.
no perfect solution.
Oh, there's no perfect solution.
Depending on what you're going to do. But so that's why it still is game over if you get if you get hardware access.
Not always, though. There are some devices out there that have been out for years that the crypto hasn't been fully pwned. Like, you're right, technically it is always possible to pwn it, but sometimes
I'm not
it's
saying
so hard
quickly or easily. Like I'm saying, they definitely can take steps to do that. I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't be taking any of the defensive steps. I'm just saying, like, as a general rule, don't count on something staying secure, even once hardware access has been gained, unless there's some other key needed. So that's why using the passphrase works, because that's not stored on the device. You need to enter that, and it can't be brute forced.
Yeah.
So in that case, it comes down to trust the math behind crypto.
So getting into some exploits, we got Zoom. So this was fun to bring up because I think on a recent episode we talked about WebEx and an authentication bypass found in that. And we got around talking to like chat room IDs and stuff like that, and how easy they were to get for a practical attack. And you actually brought up.
So I think, I mentioned there that I thought the IDs might have just been a number. I believe I may have just been thinking of Zoom, because I've used Zoom a lot more than I've used WebEx. So I might have just been thinking about these meetings and not the WebEx one. So some of my statements during the last episode may have been mistaken. That said, really easy kind of issue here to cover. As you can guess, the meeting IDs are 9, 10, or 11 digits. If you know the meeting ID and there's no password, you can basically just go to the Zoom URL with that meeting ID and get in. It's zoom.us/j/ID. All they do in this little article is they randomly generate. I think they generate just 10,000 or 1,000. They took 1,000 random meeting IDs, just using random int, nothing nothing special going on there to generate them, and then just checked if they were legitimate meetings, and they found that 4% of them were valid meetings.
I mean, there was kind of that oracle too, where if it was an invalid meeting, it would tell you that right away.
I mean, that's kind of a given
so they could, like,
with
brute force it.
Well, they brute force. They still have to make the request to that meeting URL to find out.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's fine. You can call that an oracle. I mean, it's either the page loads what you want it to, it loads an actual thing or not. There aren't a lot of alternatives to that. Oh.
Obviously, I mean, it's the attack.
I mean, like,
itself,
that's not an issue. I'm not going to say Zoom should have the same page show up if a meeting is valid or invalid.
Well, they did end up doing that, though. They did end up removing that notice as part of, like, their mitigation strategy. So that's why I brought it up, just because they do end up actually changing that. I think they have in the bottom, Zoom will no longer automatically indicate if a meeting ID is valid or not. For each attempt, it will attempt to join the meeting. So it's harder to narrow down the pool of possible meetings.
So that takes, longer time to do, because it does attempt to join rather than just saying that's a fair. I mean, it is a fair mitigation. I would have gone, and as they did do, replace just a ID with a cryptographically strong ID.
Yeah, like that was
and they've started
solution.
having passwords by default also. That was one of their other mitigations that they brought in.
Which I did wonder about that. Like, I don't think they actually said, but I wonder if by default they mean like it's just a static password, in which case that doesn't really do much if it's just a hard-coded default credential.
No, I believe they mentioned it's just
randomly generated.
Well, it just requires, it's part of your settings there. So I believe they'll have to enter a password to be used.
Okay, so it's required.
It's part of the setting while you're creating it, though, during that form. So it's not just an ID. Or it might be randomly generated, actually, but they've required. It's highly unlikely it's going to be a static password.
Yeah, it's just the way it was worded kind of had me
fair enough.
wondering on that. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, overall, the attack, technically it's practical, but it's not something you can't really target it, right? It's not like you're gonna join like a billion meetings and find which one, try to find a specific one. But it's cool that Zoom took it seriously. They took a few steps to try to remediate that.
I mean, it's a really common issue because this is basically your IDOR stuff, your insecure direct access. And I mean, a lot of places end up doing that. They will set up a key or an ID that you can just kind of increment and find a bunch of information. So, I mean, it's a real issue, but a lot of places just don't really recognize until somebody points it out how easy it can be to exploit that. Especially when there are certain visible mitigations or visible hindrances. So, nobody's going to go through all of those numbers, but it's small enough that you could just randomly generate some of them. But, I mean, you need to know it. They're not really thinking about, well, how difficult is it to guess?
I almost forgot one of the other steps they took that I thought was good, and I was a bit surprised they didn't do already, was if they check if people are repeatedly scanning for meeting IDs, and if they do, they block the device for a bit. I think that's
what if
also
I just forgot my meeting ID?
Well, it sucks to be you.
Which is something that generally isn't going to happen too often.
Yeah. So from Why Not Security, they put out a post about TeamViewer, and specifically about TeamViewer storing user passwords. And so the blog post was from a person who was doing a pen test for a client. And when they were doing that, they came across a backup of registry keys for TeamViewer. And when they did, they came across the actual name for the keys, and it was options password AES and security password AES. So obviously when you see AES, you can see that that's kind of an issue, because AES, if you have the key in the IV, you can decrypt the data, right? And the key is right in the registry there. So
yeah, and the IV generally isn't considered to be a secret value. Like, the IV is something that should be knowable. And the key obviously should be kept secret. But yeah, in this case, so if you can guess already, TeamViewer was storing user passwords encrypted with AES-128, using a static key and static IV across all of their clients. Now, it doesn't say how often this changed or if it was changed, but it sounds like they basically were using this for a fair chunk of time.
Yeah, I will say that this article did seem to be a bit long for what
it's a bit rambly.
It's a bit rambly because it is a fairly simple issue. I mean, so they confirmed that it works on TeamViewer 7 out of the box. They said it works on TeamViewer 14 as well if the security password exported key is available. I'm not entirely sure.
Well, the other thing is with 14 is that they also introduced a scripting language, which is kind of where the more important part of this comes in. Because generally speaking, these passwords you might hear, TeamViewer storing user password only encrypted. This isn't like TeamViewer storing your credentials on their server that way. This is local storage in kind of your local Windows registry. Contains an encrypted version of it. So, the initial thought, if it's being encrypted, shame on them. Plain text passwords or effectively plain text passwords, go shame TeamViewer. Obviously, this is still an issue, but it is just local. Now, that said, some of the bigger issues are what you can use this, if you know the credentials, what you could use it for. So in this case, TeamViewer, you remote in, you can schedule tasks to run through their service at the system level. So knowing the password, you have system level access. In particular with TeamViewer 14, on like the enterprise versions, they include a scripting language that will again run as system. So, you go into a client, they have TeamViewer Enterprise, just access the registry and you can escalate up to system immediately.
That's always fun.
So that's where this becomes more of an issue. It's not that your passwords are going to be decrypted by, Joe random hacking TeamViewer. I mean, maybe TeamViewer is doing this on the server too. We don't actually know, but at the very least, we can say that here it does require that local access, but that is still a fairly concerning threat.
So there were a few things in this article that I found kind of weird. One was near the top. You can see they said it was assigned to CVE, CVE 2019-18988. When I actually looked up that CVE, it was something entirely unrelated. It was like a SCADA issue.
It's the wrong CVE number. It's just a mistake.
I guess just a typo or whatever. And the other thing is, it doesn't seem like TeamViewer cares too much about this issue. Near the conclusion, they said they sent for a status update on the 13th of January, and I don't think they ever got a response on that. So it doesn't seem like TeamViewer cares too much about the issue.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was saying, there's definitely, especially on the enterprise side, where this can be used to very quickly get system access. That's a huge issue, in my opinion. That said, I do kind of wonder why they're using it as encrypted, why a hash doesn't work.
I was wondering about that too.
I feel like at this point, I feel like either this is some legacy thing, it's been there, they've been doing that forever and ever, and it's just legacy code and nobody wants to touch it. Because, TeamViewer has been around for a while, but it's also been known, always hash the passwords at the very least. Obviously you should be using at this point, a password-based key derivation and not just hashing it. But encrypting the password is something that somebody decided needed to be done. And I can't think of a reason why. I can't see why just the hash wouldn't work.
Yeah, it seems kind of weird. I'm kind of on the same line of thinking of you. It must be some legacy reason. I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure if it's a legacy reason or if it just does something that I'm not thinking of that requires them to know the password. At first, my initial thought was, okay, maybe they need to pass that password over to Windows because I know they let you do some pre-login stuff. But no, it's different credentials. It's your TeamViewer credentials that it's got there. It's not your Windows credentials. So it's not that, but that was kind of my initial thought. And I don't... Like, it seems like anywhere that they'd have to use it, they should just be able to validate with the hash. Because, like, the security doesn't seem to really change all that much if validating the hash versus actually validating the content, like the encrypted value or not. Like, I don't see why they need it. And I don't think the article touched on anything they were doing. But somebody had to have made that decision at some point.
Yeah. So, who knows? We'll have to see going forward if TeamViewer even, addresses this issue. I mean, they did receive an email in near the end of November saying we're looking into it, but
well, yeah, but that was 10 days or whatever, a little bit more than that after they reported it. Yeah, and then it's been December, January, February.
Yeah, so who knows, if it's gonna be fixed anytime soon. We'll just have to see going forward. But as it stands, this issue is still, kind of I don't want to say 0 day, but I guess that is the right terminology for it. It's not patched, so we'll see if that issue is still going forward.
I'd kind of be curious what type numbers they have for using TeamViewer at the enterprise level. I can definitely see it being used. I haven't run into it. But I mean, they have obviously or at least at one point, they had a really significant user base. It's been taken down now with some of the HTML5 stuff, having more web-based stuff. But TeamViewer was very popular for a time. And so I can kind of see it, them having been able to leverage that into a lot of enterprise clients.
I was going to say also that I'm pretty sure a few years ago, wasn't TeamViewer hacked? Wasn't their site compromised or something? And then there was malicious
now that you're mentioning it,
being distributed.
I remember something, but I don't remember any details about that.
Okay. Yeah. But, you can bet this is this type of information is probably going to be good for pen testers out there.
And they provided a Metasploit module for this too.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. So, if you're a pen tester, this is probably some cool information you can have in your toolkit. And if you come across an enterprise that uses that, you're in luck. But yeah, so getting into some more technical stuff, we have a buffer overflow in sudo.
Yes, finally some more technical stuff here.
Yeah, we were pretty high level for a while there. So yeah, there's a buffer overflow in the Studio utility when the password feedback option is turned on. So this option
before you jump into this one, there was no proof of concept release, so there isn't imminent risk right now. I mean, somebody could potentially build a proof of concept. I do want to touch on that a little bit later, but I do want to mention, don't be like me. If you want to play around with this exploit at all, and you want to, maybe take a look at the crash and see what happens. I decided this morning as I was writing up my notes for this to take a look at the crash, try and cause it on. And I just happened to be logged into one of my servers. I mean, I could have done it on local VM. I just happened to have the shelf. So I'm like, okay, whatever, let's use that. Of course, you can't just go and, GDB sudo. It's going to... Or you can't... Sorry, I was trying to get the crash down first before I was going to try and run it under GDB. So try and get the crash down. Of course, it's a SEHUID binary, so you're not going to get a crash down for that. So I could either go ahead and just enable global crash dumps, or, I could just remove SEHUID from sudo and go ahead and just run it again to get the crash. So naturally, I went ahead and just removed SEHUID from sudo. Problem there is, how do I get SEHUID back from there? It turns out I didn't know the root password, so I couldn't SU back into root and kind of locked myself out for a little while. So, be aware. Obviously, had I been thinking about what I was doing, I would have very quickly realized that wouldn't work anyhow, since sudo does tell you and gives you a little warning saying, hey, I need to be a SEHUID binary, and complained, so it didn't help. But I also kind of messed up my system for a while.
It is one thing that you want to be a bit more careful before messing with, for sure.
I mean, I thought I had the root password, and then when I went to actually go on there, I obviously didn't. I'd just been always using sudo on that machine.
Yeah. So the password feedback option, it basically allows a visual display of a password being inputted. So like on a lot of, Linux or Unix systems and utilities, when you type a password, nothing shows up. So for people who, want that visual feedback that a password is actually being typed, there's that option, and it does the masking. It has the asterisks for each character entered of the password. So that option most of the time isn't enabled by default, but there are some distros that do. I think Linux Mint is one of them.
Mint and
Elementary OS is
Elementary
another one.
OS, yeah, are the two that kind of have been coming up as ones that do enable that by default.
Yeah. But the big thing for this is this bug can be triggered by users who aren't in the sudoers file. So that's where kind of that impact comes from if it is actually enabled. And I think the core issue is that the option should be ignored when the password is being read from something other than a terminal.
I'll walk through the issue. I've actually just brought up kind of the code.
Okay,
and actually, I'm going to bring up just the old code. So the commit here has a few different changes being made. Most of them don't matter. Like it adds in a feedback variable instead of just checking instead of just checking the flag every time. Basically caches it. It does some stylistic changes like prefix versus postfix change or decrement operator. But the change that matters is this one. While, like I said, I'll bring up the actual kind of file here instead of just looking at the change. But basically, it's another one of those kind of early returns that ends up causing the issue. I should have taken note of what line this issue was on. I think it was like 405 or something. Here we go. So you'll notice basically in the code, this is starting at 386 for those of you who can see. You've essentially just got this loop where it's going through what's left in the buffer to read. While left or prefix, decrement, left, and left just contains how many bytes are left in the buffer. It'll read one character. So this is a character processing loop, notorious for bugs. You see these loops, especially when they kind of jump around, as this one does. It does play around with the destination pointer, which is the CP variable. Plays around with that a little bit as it increments or decrements it as it goes. When you see that, so often there are issues in these types of loops.
No comment too. That's a good indicator. All this complex code.
Well, there is one here that's erase stars.
Oh, okay.
But so this loop is actually really simple if you look at it. It reads the character, or at least this part of the loop, reads the character, checks if it's a new line, or if it didn't read, breaks if it gets a new line, otherwise has the if feedback, and if you ignore that, it basically just goes, stores the character red, that's C, into CP, increments the pointer, so, moves one forward, and repeats the loop. It's this big feedback thing, which is where if this password feedback feature is enabled, it will go into all of this. So most of the code here is basically just dealing with this password feedback, of course. So what ends up happening is kind of the case that matters is when you give this thing that isn't a terminal, that isn't a unidirectional file descriptor to write to, or write and read to. It'll be able to read, but it won't be able to write back onto it. So it'll give write errors every time it tries to actually write. And the other thing is when you do that, you'll notice it's comparing the character that it reads to, like sudo term EOF, sudo term kill, and sudo term erase. Those are variables that get initialized. So when you're not on an actual terminal, they're just 0. So if you're able to send the null bytes, you can, or at least for the one that matters here, the term kill ends up being 0. I'm not actually sure what, if erase is initialized to something else, but term kill at least ends up being 0. So, when you give it this input and you send it a null byte, it'll go and it'll match that and it'll be like, oh, the terminal is being killed or whatever. let's jump into this loop. Which all that loop does is it's writing \b space \b, which is backspace space backspace, which is essentially it's removing kind of things that's already written to the screen. So when it does that, because it's trying to write to that file descriptor that can't actually be written to, it'll break. It'll be like, hey, I got an error. Let's just break the loop. And that loop that it's breaking is this while like the buffer one. So when it leaves that, it'll go and set just left to the buffer size. It'll say, okay, we walk through the entire buffer. And that's where the problem comes in. The CP value that's actually storing kind of the buffer it's copying data into doesn't get decrement, doesn't get reset. But when it leaves, it'll get that buffer size set in kind of how many bytes it has left, which is this main loop. It's just going through however many bytes left. So every time it gets a no byte, it basically resets the amount of bytes it has left to read. So if you send it, bunch of A's, no byte, bunch more A's, or I think the example one actually just sends more no bytes, but it essentially just resets how many bytes it'll keep reading. So you can go ahead and overflow the buffer that way because it'll just keep reading from there. So with that, it is a stack-based overflow. I did go and take a look. It's overflowing. Let me see if I could find it in here. Ultimately, yeah, it's just overflowing this buffer here. So it's on the stack. It's in part of a tgetPass is the function. A stack-based overflow. And what I was trying to figure out was whether or not sudo was compiled by default with any canaries. I don't know if you know that, Spectre.
I don't, but I mean, I'm surprised like you didn't just run it through checksec. Wouldn't checksec be able to? It
would have, and I actually thought about that right after I had that issue, so okay. I didn't even bother. But yeah, checksec would have. But at that point, I figured I kind of had to fix that, and I moved off. But but yeah, so I'm not sure. That was something I had meant to also go back to before we did this. Nonetheless, I mean, whether or not it has that, you're still needing an address. Let's assume it doesn't. You still need an address to jump to. So you need an ASLR bypass with this, unless you turn ASLR off, but that's not a real world scenario.
Yeah.
So you still need something else to weaponize this. I know I was kind of the thing that prompted me to look at that was I was on one of the Reddit threads. A few comments were like, should be pretty easy to make your own exploit for this, or yeah, it seems easy even with things like NX and ASLR. And I'm kind of thinking, no, this doesn't seem like it's going to be too easy. This is one part of the exploit.
Well, you could potentially, like, there might be something else on the stack there that you could
partially
overwrite that could be useful. Like, I see pass or something like that. If you can overwrite the password or something like that, I don't know.
There might be other attacks to go for, but if there is that, like, that's not a immediately straightforward path to getting code execution. This is likely, if you had a read gadget, if you could find, like, I guess you've got these SIG actions. So there might be something actually with that might be exploitable.
Yeah. Could be fun to try to look into maybe on a stream or something. That could be fun.
Yeah, there are also those callback pointers. Those might be, you'd have, obviously that's beyond your RET. 5 in 64-bit.
Yeah, and 64-bit would be in the register, so it wouldn't be on the stack.
That's kind of what I was just trying to figure out. Yeah, that wouldn't be on the stack. Although if we say this is 32-bit, I mean that could be on the stack.
One thing I'm thinking about is you were saying that the position could be reset, right? So could you control where past the buffer you write by the number of nulls? Because if you have a control that it bounds right, then that would probably be easier to exploit.
That would help if you didn't have canaries. Yeah, so I'm not sure actually on what happens if it writes anything when it sees those nulls. That would be something you'd have to look through. That could actually be a valid route to at least pinpoint just the return pointer. Then it wouldn't matter if it had the canary.
Yeah. That could be
which I'm not even sure if it does. I mean,
This is sounding like something we should do on a stream. Like it'd be a fun stream. I don't know. Maybe we'll do that on Friday or something. Be fun to look into.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely kind of an interesting route to get the overflow because it's not just sending a bunch of text. Like there is that mechanism there of resetting the counter that, you know, makes it a little bit more interesting to play with. So
absolutely,
yeah, might be something to stream on Friday.
Yeah, I say it quite a bit, but this is another one of those issues. It's like classic CTF type issue that we'll probably see in a CTF eventually. So, but yeah, I mean, this could be fun to look into. Maybe we'll look at it on Friday. We'll discuss that a little bit more. But yeah, obviously, you know, it's been fixed in 1.8.31. If you can't update though, you can just disable the password feedback option. You know, if you can't update
if
for
you
whatever
even
reason.
had it active.
Yeah, if you even had it active. So
which
it's not
is
totally...
that's definitely like that's one of those areas that it's not completely unheard of to have that active. As we mentioned, there are some distros that have it by default. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's it definitely restricts how often this is going to be useful though.
Yeah. So moving on to Opkg, are actually...
Well, it's part of OpenWRT. Package manager in there. They've got an Opkg.
Yeah,
4.
I got confused there. I skipped ahead. So yeah, Opkg. There was a security advisory put out. So for those of you who don't know, OpenWRT, it's basically an open source OS for embedded stuff. Most commonly routers. There's a lot of people that I know that use OpenWRT routers. And Opkg is the package manager for that, like Z was saying. And the issue is that the fork of Opkg that OpenWRT uses ignores the SHA-256 checksums embedded in the signed repo index. So there's no integrity checking on the IPK artifacts. So if you can man in the middle it, you know, since there's no checksums on that data, you can corrupt the package. And because Opkg is root, if you exploit it, you could get root code execution, which you can guess of why that would be you know, quite important, quite impactful.
Yeah,
but,
you know, I thought it was
that fact.
I thought it was interesting, kind of how this exploit happened.
Okay, so before you go into that, I'll just say, obviously, you do need man in the middle to pull this off. So there is quite a high conditional to that. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there because that is an important note. But sorry, you can go into.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it requires that privileged attacker. But yeah. I mean, that's why we have the hashes in the first place. Or well, it's part of why. Obviously, the hashes themselves don't security necessarily for man in the middle, 'cause man in the middle can be, you know, they'd be able to replace what the hashes are also.
Yeah.
That said, then it won't be signed. I believe some of these are signed at least, but the actual exploit here, or the code that leads to the exploit, I should say. Essentially, what it does is a lot of the code here. So this is the commit that I've brought up. And a lot of this, it kind of involves a bit of a rename. What it does here in this first little change, it has this source variable, removes that, and starts using this S pointer, which is essentially a const. Yeah, it uses the source, but treats it as a constant now. So basically, they've renamed this buffer in there that it's reading from, and that's all they're really doing, just changing that. And it's really easy to miss, but in this one where it does the checksum hex to bin, so it's figuring out what the checksum is and trying to read it. You'll notice in the code they've got these removed lines there where it has the source 0 and all of that, and then it's changing that to use the S variable, but they missed one spot. They missed this while loop right up at the top where it uses the source variable instead of this new S variable. And source is still valid. Like that comes from, that's one of the arguments. They're just making the constant, the S variable as a constant so they can access it through that. And then if they try to change something, you know, it'll complain, and technically it's kind of a smarter move to do that. But they forgot to change in this one place. So this one pushes forward that source pointer, but it never moves the S pointer forward. So this is skipping your white space. So what ends up happening is it basically reads the white space. It's not a hex digit, returns as an empty hash, basically.
That sucks.
Yeah,
Such
I
a
mean,
subtle issue.
yeah, I could understand how, somebody glances over that. What I don't get is how this didn't get caught in any sort of testing. I don't know what type testing they do, but this seems like
Maybe
some that
none.
should have been caught in testing. Just by having
Yeah.
the test case, does it accept an invalid package?
Yeah, this is definitely a case that should have been caught by any like
At least I imagine.
test-driven
Maybe
development.
maybe there's something more complicated that I'm not aware of. I do try and be charitable when I make those comments, and sometimes there are things I'm just not aware of, and I'm making these assumptions that, oh, of course you'd catch it, because I mean hindsight's 2020.
Yeah, I'm kind of like that too, just because I feel like I was a lot more harsh before until I started working on my own projects that were, started to get a lot more complicated and messy. I think it is kind of hard to realize from an outsider point of view how easy it is to introduce these kinds of bugs and how easy it is to skip over them. Though, like you said, something like this should have been caught in like a test case or something like that.
Yeah, like I could
But
understand having the code mistake here.
yeah,
It's just, you're looking through, and then of course, well above in the previous function, you just did that for loop. So again, you just kind of skip there, and there's actually a name for these sorts of errors. I can't remember what it is, but it's common enough to make that sort of mistake where you have similar code in multiple places and you're making kind of the same change. So you make kind of the wrong change in some places because it seems similar enough.
yeah.
Either way, definitely common. Like, I get that. But also really obvious when you're just looking at it here.
Yeah. So another one of those fun issues that's easy to see when you actually look at it, but in the overall context of the code base, it's a pretty subtle issue. And then
Well, especially because everything works too. Like, I mean, in your normal use case, nothing's gone wrong here. There's no error, there's no warning.
it's just a lack of testing edge cases. Yeah.
Yep.
But getting into some more memeable issues, wide open BSD is returned. We got an LPE and RCE in OpenSMTPD, which is the daemon for SMTP for OpenBSD. And so it's a logic bug that leads to command injection as root. So as the title suggests, it can be exploited both locally and remotely. And remotely if it's set to an uncommon to default configuration where it listens on all interfaces and accepts external mail.
Which you shouldn't do. Just saying.
Yeah, good addition in there. They have a function basically that validates the sender and recipient addresses. And they check for dangerous characters like a semicolon, and it tries to replace them with colons to prevent this exact issue.
Yeah,
on the
one
shell
key
that
thing.
Executes the MDA commands.
One thing I'll just mention is it does split this up into two parts. The local part where it because it has different characters that are allowed obviously in your local versus your domain part, but it does that separately. Is like, is it a valid local part? Is it a valid domain part?
Yeah, that's good. That's good to bring up because there's an issue where if the domain name is empty and part of the address is invalid, as in it contains invalid characters, it'll add the default domain and it'll just return true, which it should return false on the validation because part of that address is invalid.
Yeah, this is another one of those code cases. I've just brought up the actual vulnerable code.
For those of you that are watching, yeah.
Yeah, for those of you watching, it does that same check that I mentioned. It looks at is valid local part, and basically this if statement is saying if it's not valid local, if the valid local part isn't valid, or if the domain part isn't valid. Let's jump into this next little segment of code where kind of the default case is it's going to return 0. It's false. But if the domain is empty, as Spectre was saying, if that's its check, the domain 0 equals null or \0, so effectively null. It'll copy in the proper domain. So this is, where you're sending like user to user on a local system. It'll just add in the domain, and it won't actually check if that local part was also causing it to be invalid. So it'll just return 1. So that's where, as long as that domain part's empty, the local part, it effectively doesn't matter if it was valid or not. It's going to go ahead and accept it.
Yeah.
Which then leads, I guess I'll go on with that. As Spectre mentioned, it does this execle call, effectively has this MDA command that gets generated. It's called, bin sh with a command, which is this mail delivery agent call. And it includes the from address. So this is that email address we're talking about that generates. It includes that right into the script that it's going to, or right into the command it's going to execute. So naturally, you include a semicolon, something like that. You break out that command, you go run your own command. Which is exactly kind of the example they give as mail from colon, and then the semicolon sleep 66 semicolon. That's the email that you use, and it passes its validation.
I like how they have a war games thing in there too. Professor Falcon. How about a nice game of chess? I just noticed that when you had it up on the screen.
I didn't catch it.
Yeah. It's a pretty trivial issue. They do mention some limitations it has, though. It's limited to 64 characters. And I think there's some issue with trying to use some of the other special characters, right? Like the $, the pipeline, stuff like that. So you do have to get
it does
creative
remove
to
some.
exploit it. Yeah, so they do actually, I think they do have a case there that will trigger it to get like a shell, and it gets very creative. They actually drew inspiration from the Morris worm, which I thought was another kind of cool part of this advisory. But yeah, it's just another one of those, kind of subtle logic bugs that can be hard to spot. I will say, though, it does seem like OpenBSD has a ton of these. I don't know if it's just because people are looking for them more in OpenBSD, or OpenBSD just has like... this is another one of those issues that you think would be caught in like test-driven development, and it makes me question. Like,
a lot of places just don't do test-driven development,
and that's what I'm thinking is that this is why we're seeing so many of these OpenBSD issues. Is they're just
I don't know this one, because this one you could write unit tests on this. So you write your unit test that's testing for a bad local, that's testing for an empty thing. This is definitely a case that you could easily miss. Whereas the other one, because it's the package thing, like it seems like it would be a lot harder to miss. Literally have a signed thing that has an invalid package hash. Make sure it rejects that. Like that seems like a really obvious case to be testing. This one though, like I can understand because you're going to at least look at initially in parts. You're going to look at that local part. Okay, will it reject an invalid one? Yes. Will it reject an invalid domain? Yes. There's kind of your two really big test cases. Will it accept normal domain and like valid stuff? Yes, it does that. I could understand maybe not thinking, well, will it do a invalid local but an empty domain? Like I could get that test case being missed. That is a little bit more of an edge case to me.
Okay, playing some devil's advocate. I mean, yeah, I'm not like disagreeing that like it's not as memeable, I think, as some of the other OpenBSD issues we've covered. This one is a little bit more forgivable, I think. It's just that we have.
To be fair, like this is just in an application on OpenBSD. It is one of their applications, of course, but it's not like kernel execution. Granted, runs as root, so it doesn't matter.
But that's the thing with OpenBSD, right? Is like their kernel security is actually pretty good. They're like ahead of the game on like mitigations and stuff like that. In terms of kernel, they're pretty solid, but their userland is just awful. And like it's one of those things where it's like, okay, kernel's harder to hit, but if userland's easier to hit, then it doesn't really matter, It just
privileged userland, yeah.
Yeah, it's the privileged userland of OpenBSD is kind of like the weakest link. And it kind of invalidates all the work that they've built on the kernel side, which is unfortunate. I wonder how many more of these OpenBSD issues we'll see in the future. It's almost like a regular segment of the show at this point. I think we've covered like probably 4 or 5.
Yeah, so. Well, it'll slow down eventually.
Hopefully, yeah. So PHP 7 had an exploit that was dropped for it 4 days ago by MM0R1 on GitHub.
Yeah, actually, so there were actually a few different exploits dropped. There's 3 of them. This is the only one that... Well, so this is the only one that's unpatched.
Ah, okay. So the bug that this exploit actually hits is 2 years old. It was in the debug backtrace function, and it basically seems to be an issue in object destructors, specifically in a case where they throw exceptions. Yeah, so if you have a destructor that throws an exception, it'll try to get a stack trace, which ends up referencing already destroyed values.
It's say use after free.
Yeah.
is essentially what's going on here. One thing to note is it calls itself a disable functions bypass, and I think we'll maybe touch on that a little bit in a bit later. But talking about the actual exploit, I believe the PHP bug report actually has like the really simple.
That's where I got most of my information from.
Yeah, well, it's clear that whoever wrote this exploit used the same thing, because you can actually look the exploit code, and you'll see obviously it's using that same vuln, using using the same destruct, or roughly the same destruct. Adds in some handling that's unique to 7.4, but essentially the same thing, and it's still like trigger. Okay, no, it's not trigger, but oh yeah, there's trigger UAF here. Like it's pretty clearly the same. Like they use that base, which is fine. Anyway, going on to the issue. Essentially, so you set off, you'll have call trigger UAF, this function. You'll call that with an argument. That argument then ends up going, make sure it's not getting, it's a string in turning. It's basically just a means, so you might have multiple strings that will, or multiple variables that will be pointing to the exact same string. This is something Java does also in some other languages. It's essentially just like a caching mechanism, if you have the same string. So it uses string shuffle to make sure it's a unique string that it gets. But it takes that argument, shuffles it, and creates a new vuln with it. Or vuln being the class name, not a new vuln. But creates a new class name that's called vuln, sets a equal to that argument, and then when you actually come into the vuln, in the destructor, so that's going to be called when that function we just saw, when that function leaves, implicitly the vuln class that was created will be destructed. So that's when this will kind of have its implicit call. Unsets the A, does a backtrace. Now, when you call for the get trace here, or debug backtrace in the 7.4 example, it'll grab what the function arguments are, which in this case, as it's going through that backtrace, those arguments have already been destroyed.
Yep.
So that's where kind of the UAF comes into play. It's already been destroyed, and you're able to basically start abusing that. It looks like it gets, so it uses this ABC variable and is able to build out essentially a read and write gadget. I think the function name that he uses is leak. Yeah, function leak, but you know, he has the two gadgets basically, the write, the leak, and goes through. You can go and read the code yourself to see faking the value. Essentially creates the object to start calling system on your own. Using that use after free. So what I want to get back to is this is disable functions bypass, not necessarily remote code execution, which is slightly different. So with this, you need to be able to run this PHP code. There aren't a lot of
conditional.
There aren't, and it's going to be running as your user, or like you're not running PHP code just as root, usually.
Hopefully not.
So this isn't privilege escalation. It's going to be running as the same user. If you're able to execute the PHP code, you're able to execute PHP code that just runs system generally. So that's why you just disable functions bypass, because that's the only time where this actually gets you anything. You should already have code execution if you're able to write your own PHP file to be executed. So oftentimes this isn't considered a security issue. Whether or not it should be, I mean, it's definitely a bug. And it looks like they took this one kind of seriously. They had this out for the couple of years. Well, so that's what I'm saying. They had this for the couple of years, and then on the 30th, somebody comes and says like, hey, this guy dropped the active exploit against this, okay, on the 29th. And then they have the patch in there by the 31st.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a comment that I thought was interesting. by one of the PHP devs, and they were like, could you please specify what you mean by exploitable? I see the specific code can trigger a UAF, but there's no issue here. It's just a regular crash. I found that kind of funny. It's just a regular crash, as if that's not a that's
well,
not an
because
issue.
a lot of crashes aren't going to be exploitable.
Yeah, but I mean, like, use after free is one of those issues that is fairly common to be more exploitable as an issue. Like, it's a pretty powerful bug, is what I mean.
Oh, for sure. And I'm just reading that comment there. I see that the specific code can trigger a UAF, but there's no security issue there.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so
comment.
I don't know. I feel like Stas has, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Obviously, that's initial with his name, but the last time we talked about a PHP bug, I think he definitely commented in there.
Okay.
Although I do kind of actually now that I'm looking at this, I do kind of like that he makes that comment. And the very next thing is by Rasmus, the creator of PHP, linking him to that exploit.
Yeah.
Like no comment, just here's the link again.
Yeah.
Which is the same link that was already provided. Oh no, that feels a little bit like a passive aggressive move. Like, this person gives them the link, and then he's just like, here's the link again.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, kind of a weird comment. But yeah, like, considering this comment, I kind of wanted to highlight something, right? I think the issue itself is, like you were saying, it's kind of interesting, but it's not a privilege escalation. But I mean, I kind of want to spin this off to discuss.
So there are places that it can be privilege escalation, though. Like, a bunch of sandboxes will usually have, like, kind of the system they'll usually have it locked down more than just at the language level, but there are cases where you're only given access to write some code and not access to the entire system, and or this disable functions actually matters, which prevents you from accessing things like exec and doing certain things on the actual system. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's more of a specific issue. But I did want to say, like, this bug, like we said earlier, it's been open for 2 years. And nobody cared to fix it, it seems. It was only after someone released an exploit abusing it that it got revisited and fixed. And there was another comment in that thread made, actually, I think by the same one that you had open earlier, saying the person who uploaded this exploit should be publicly shamed, and this is illegal in the United States. First of all, that's not true. It's not illegal. I don't know where they got this idea from. Just not true. But I mean, as much as you may want to morally grandstand like this person did against people who drop exploits for this, if this exploit wasn't dropped, who knows how much longer it could have been before this issue was even addressed. It was only because that exploit was linked that this exploit was addressed, or this bug was addressed. So it's one of those cases where I think it kind of sheds some positive light on that full disclosure angle, and that, this person is saying, like, full disclosure is bad and it's legal and all this stuff. It's like,
well, so they take issue because they
happened,
They take issue though because they didn't notify them beforehand, and that would have been a more responsible way to go about this. Would be to have notified them, like, been like, hey, I actually have a proof of concept here that gets to run system or whatever, that actually does something, before just publicly dumping it. So, like, I mean, the fact that they fixed it once there was an exploit, I think, is a good move on their part. Like, somebody proved, okay, hey, we were wrong, this isn't actually a non-exploitable issue. They went and they fixed it reasonably quickly too.
Yeah.
So I can understand what you're saying, but I do think there is a more responsible way to have gone about it. Which is, like I said, like, we've talked actually the last few episodes now about kind of disclosure policies, but and I've kind of always leaned towards the non-disclosure. Now, when I say that, I just mean, like, disclosing it to the vendor and letting them do what they want. Mm-hmm. Either publicly disclosing it or not. So that could have, been in play here. I don't know. I can agree that this wasn't a very nice move. That said, the person who posted this, so I saw this on Reddit. The person who posted this said that they don't consider it a security issue, so they might have been told that at some point. I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, they took this pretty seriously once it was shown that it, could be used. So I'm not going to really fault them on fixing it once there was a POC, but it not actually being a huge concern before that. Like, obviously, they've got thousands of bugs to fix. It's PHP after all.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like 2018, like,
there are bugs
like
definitely older than that. It's something that, unless they see a really big reason to go into fixing it, like, so let's assume this wasn't exploitable and this was just a crash. How seriously do they need to take this? Obviously, it's something to be fixed, but, when or how long should that really take to fix? What takes higher priority?
Yeah, I guess it is. It's a triaging issue, I guess. It's definitely a fair point. It's just, I can't help but feel like, if this wasn't disclosed, and even if it was disclosed privately, I don't think they would have taken it as seriously, honestly. So
it might not have fixed it quite as quickly. I do think they would have taken it seriously. I mean, we have covered another PHP exploit where it was disclosed to them and they went ahead and fixed it, and then the person did like a full disclosure on it after it was fixed. So, once it's been shown there, I don't... Like, as much as fun as it is to, hate on PHP, there are legitimate developers behind PHP that do at least care to some extent. Now, they might have some disagreeable views at times, but, you give them a proof of concept that actually results in bypassing one of the things. Now, they do recommend that disable functions not actually be used for security. Basically, it's the same thing like Windows doesn't consider UAC bypass as an actual issue because technically you already should have those privileges. It's kind of in the same realm.
I mean, I can see what you're saying with, like, if it was disclosed privately and they see that it's demonstrated to be exploitable, that they would take it more seriously. It's just that my confidence in that was kind of shaken by reading some of the comments in here. Like, somebody linking exploit showing that it's exploitable, and then they're like, what do you mean by exploitable? It's just a crash. Like,
yeah, no, I agree with that comment.
There's a
for
bit
sure.
Of a shaky
and that's actually, I was kind of mentioning how I think we've seen this guy before in one of the other comments. Or in one of the other issues. I don't remember what he said, but I remember he was kind of the one against something being patched. Like, I remember his name in a negative light. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So, I don't want to argue with it too hard on it. Like, I think it's one of those things too where I'm more towards full disclosure than you are. It's just like more of a personal point. So,
well, like, this
is kind of a point for my team. I guess, if I was to put it in a way. But yeah, just one of those things where, it has been fixed. Or at least I'm pretty sure it's been fixed, right? Did
there is a fix. Whether or not this has been upstreamed yet, like whether or not it's actually released, I don't know. But there is a fix.
Yeah, so, if it's not out yet, it will be deployed at some point. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight some of those comments because there were some interesting comments in that chain. I think that was actually even more interesting than the actual bug itself. I just want to see the chat. I mean, they fix bugs after it has a POC, only as UAF. Yeah, I mean,
I was kind of talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the POC definitely makes it higher in the triage in terms of like priority to get fixed. But yeah, I just wanted to address that. I didn't want to leave that sitting in the chat. So moving on from PHP, we got some vulnerabilities in Azure Cloud. So this article was written by the guys at Checkpoint, and their main focus of it was they wanted to focus on the cloud, right? Because a lot of people focus on like the client applications and misconfigurations, but they don't focus on the cloud infrastructure
the cloud
itself.
Infrastructure. Yeah,
it's not really touched on too often, so that's where they want to kind of.
It's a lot more blind. It's a lot harder to start exploring, the infrastructure of the cloud. Which is where they kind of talk about that as actually setting up a research environment for Azure, which allows them to have like this Azure SDK, which you can run on as kind of a singular machine, and has some of the same things the cloud has. So you can kind of see the cloud infrastructure and start testing at that level, which is interesting because you wouldn't have been able to really discover this issue without having compromised the cloud already or having that internal information. And so they've put out 2 articles. Both of them have a lot of overview, a lot of background information, which is
a lot of
reasonably
reverse engineering.
Yeah, like they talk a lot about the process and how they discovered everything. Like it's a good read, but it's a lot of information that you maybe don't need to at least understand the issue. So the issue,
yeah, it was a bit
the
dense.
issue in this one is there's this data service that's basically just a REST API that's used in the background that can do various things. Querying information about various virtual machines. One of them is you can get a virtual machine screenshot. So if you've used Hyper-V before, you'll notice it shows you a little screenshot of what's currently running. This is the type of thing that would be used for that. You can get a screenshot. You can give it a specific resolution so you're not stuck with just that little snapshot version. Just an HTTP request or over to, get the screenshot, give it the ID for what you want, and give it the resolution. No authentication. Yeah, that's the other big thing. No authentication needed to do that. Obviously, this is running on an internal service. This isn't like exposed to the internet. This is used internally by the cloud. Like it's part of the cloud infrastructure. But because you know that that's there, available without authentication, if you have something like a server-side request forgery or anything that kind of makes those sorts of requests, you can abuse that to then get a screenshot of any running VM, which naturally they went ahead and found such a example or such a SSRF in it was a load template.
You can load template from any remote URL and it just doesn't check if it's a local remote or anything. I did want to add on there, you do need the machine ID to get the screenshot, so there is kind of another vector that they use because there's another API endpoint that doesn't require authentication that allows you to get some sensitive information. Yeah, like the machine ID, hardware information, how many cores, stuff like that. So you do kind of chain those together to get that screenshot functionality. I just want to mention that. Yeah,
which is a fair point. I'm just kind of pointing the gist of this attack was getting that screenshot through an SSRF. Sure. And I like seeing the SSRF. It's one of those attacks. It's a serious attack. And when you can abuse it, there's often a lot of things you can do. But it takes that internal knowledge. You can port scan. That's kind of the classic example with SSRF. You just port scan and know what's open or closed. Can't really do a ton beyond that, though, unless you start really being able to figure out what all is available, which, of course, you might start with the port scan to figure out what's open and then figure out from there. But it's nice to see SSRF being attacked in a reasonable situation here. Like, they cover how they found out about these internal services.
Yeah. The second part takes kind of a lower level view of it. The second part talks about a buffer overflow actually that allows the sandbox escape, so it's a lot more technical than the first part. We were kind of reading it before the stream. I didn't get to read it as much as I'd like to, but it talks about more of the lower level view of the Azure cloud infrastructure, specifically focusing on web workers. Which are basically like the servers that host the applications. So each application will have a service, access to a service called DWA SSVC. I couldn't actually see what that actually stood for. But yeah, what that basically has, it has a bunch of like little services you can use. And the app is sandboxed, obviously, right? And there's a driver to interface with the sandbox with various sandbox settings, and one of them is called RS filter, which is exposed to user space. And after a ton of like reversing and stuff like that, they ended up finding an interprocess communication or IPC mechanism, which they call IPM pipes, which are used to send messages between these different services. And when the pipe receives a message, when one end of the pipe receives a message, it calls a function called reallocate worker item. And it passes this user space past worker item, which contains a data length, and you can already probably see where this is going. They use this data length for the allocation of a new size, but the mem copy is performed with the worker item size. Usually this isn't an issue because these sizes are calculated automatically, but if an attacker can control these, they can cause a discrepancy between those two sizes, and you end up having a heap overflow.
Yeah, so I'll mention here that usually you don't actually send these messages directly. You're calling some sort of function that helps you interact, which in this case, there's a DWAS interop DL that you can include that will automatically determine the size. To send there, it'll fill it in for you and just send it off. But yeah, as you said, it's wrapped.
Yeah. So if you unwrap it and do it yourself, you can exploit that issue and get a buffer overflow. So they basically brute force all the open handles, and then when they find one, they send it a message with a data length of 0 and a really long message.
Yeah, when they find one that seems to be this one in particular.
Yeah.
They do a little bit of work to try and find that.
What's funny is I think the component that they actually did this through was SMB. And for anybody who's familiar with WannaCry, that used Eternal Blue, which was also a heap of overflow in SMB. So, that's kind of they actually make a little note of that, kind of a funny little connection. But yeah, I like this little 2-article part series. I like that they kind of split them up so that you have the less technical and the more technical. That way you can read one without, if you don't want all the technical details of the other one, you don't want that low-level view. You still have the first one, right, to look at.
Yeah, I understand why they did this as like just part 1 and part 2, but I feel like this could have also just been like just two completely separate articles too.
Yeah, because they are very separate issues.
Yeah, like the audience that's going to understand the first one and the audience that's going to understand the second one may overlap, but like, yeah, I mean, I get why, like, they're definitely related. Yeah, and like part of the same project, but yeah, no, that's not much of an issue to complain about, though.
What I liked about these write-ups is it didn't just tunnel in on the exploit itself. They focused a lot on like that, digging for information. Like over half of the article is just reversing and trying to figure out what's going on. And I think
that makes it valuable, I think, to people to read it because it's covering so much of the background. I kind of mentioned at the outset there, it covers a lot of background that maybe you don't need to just understand the issue. You can understand the issue without knowing that, but it's a lot of background that's absolutely useful to know. And like, if you want to dig into this and start playing around with stuff, like, it's information that you might actually want to know. And it's all laid out here, how they kind of discovered and how they came about different issues.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to get your feet wet and get started on it with these kinds of articles. And because there's a lot more of that background information, it also makes it a lot more accessible for other types of issues. If you're researching into Azure Cloud and you're not looking at this specific bug, but you're looking at a different bug that's in a similar area, you can use a lot of the information from this article in your case, even if it's not specific to your issue. That is one very valuable and I think often overlooked point of some of these types of articles that have this information is it's more usable than ones that just tunnel in on their specific issue.
Yeah, well, one thing I'd kind of mention on that is it comes down to the whole process of you need to understand the system that you're attacking. Or the more that you understand kind of the core system that you're targeting, the more you're able to exploit. So this is part of that process. It's not the exploit part of it, but it's part of the process that's necessary. So I do appreciate they included it. That said, I might get a little bit annoyed if it gets included all the time with like every exploit write-up. In this case, like, this is something that I don't think there's enough information out about. So like, I get it here. But at the same time, sometimes you just want to know the exploit. You just want to know what happened, what the issue was, because you're not going to attack that same system. You're going to want to apply it onto something completely different. But the exploit mechanism or technique might be relevant. So, like, I'd get annoyed if it's like, some random... I don't know, some random text highlighter that they go into all the details about. It might be interesting to know, but that could kind of go on its own topic then too, or like its own post rather than being included. But when it's something like Azure Cloud, like, that is kind of a big area that a lot of people are going to be looking at, like, it makes more sense here. But I would get annoyed if every bug we started looking at included like a ton of background information.
This is also probably the first article I've seen that goes into any technical depth into Azure, just because it's one of those things that's usually a more closed off system, so it's definitely more appropriate here.
Yeah, I didn't know there even was this SDK that you could run
I didn't
locally.
either. I don't really, obviously, I'm not like into Microsoft stuff. I don't really work with Azure, but still cool to know. If you ever want to get into doing that. So definitely, yeah, awesome article. Definitely
Roll
worth
your
checking
own
out.
cloud with it, compute with them.
Yep.
To be fair, it only runs on one machine. It's not something you could use like that. Although I guess Azure does have the on-premises cloud, which you could do that, but that's also not free.
Yeah. So we'll end off with a fun topic, and we've actually been talking about some assistants and stuff lately, and this one is OK Google bypass the authentication. You can already tell it's going to be a fun article just by the title.
Website
Oh man, okay, there's Google going off. I should have known. But
Well, is it bypassing the authentication on your end?
It's not yet. No, I didn't say the right word.
But yeah, as you said, it's a auth bypass. I don't know. The poster here. This is mediaservice.net, their tech blog. They tried to put the blame on Google for this issue, and I do disagree with it. But the basic issue, there are actually a few areas that kind of lead to this issue. One is that there's this API key that's used by Google Assistant. So this isn't something user sees. This is Google Assistant will pull down this API key to use for something requested, like their actual API, whoever their client is. This API key is just kind of a global thing. It's just, you could use this to access all the users, everybody, do anything you want with it. And then the other issue is when you get an error, it just goes to default intent, which just happens to be kind of like that main options intent, which happens after login. So if you can cause an error before login, it'll jump to the main intent. And because it has kind of the valid API key, that's valid for any user instead of being more limited to just the one user that's actually been authenticated, it'll work with whoever it thinks you are. And then in particular, where kind of the Google Assistant comes in, is when you say some certain words, such as, in this particular case, using the Italian words a capo, probably didn't pronounce that correctly, but essentially saying the word like new line or return. When you use that as an input when it's asking for your password and you just give it a new line, there'll be that error. It'll just jump up to, well, you're authenticated as whatever username you gave us, and it'll just kind of ignore the fact that your password was wrong. So, kind of that's the gist of it. I mean, it isn't too hard, I think, to understand the issue there. Error happens, early return again, and you end up with this API key that gives you access to everybody, so any user you try to use will just be accepted.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to mute my mic there for a sec while I got rid of it. I should have put my phone further away. I didn't even think about it. But yeah, what kind of interested me is that the Italian word, the a capo or whatever it is for return or new line, worked, but like English doesn't. Like if you say new line in English, it doesn't work.
Well, I'm assuming this was an Italian product.
Oh, okay.
I can't see any other reason why they'd even be trying a capo without that.
Yeah, it seems kind of weird. I wish they gave a little bit more information on why they went that route specifically. But
well, I would imagine, I don't know for sure. I would guess that if you were dealing with it in English, you can get it to put a new line in if you had it in English. Like, that just seems like something that the assistant should do when it's going to transcribe the information to you. It's like if you say the word dash, like, I need, ID 123 dash ABC or something. You would expect it to put in that dash for you, not to actually use the word dash. Similarly, I could imagine the assistant, you say, 123 new line ABC, that it would just insert a new line, not the words new line.
Yeah.
That would at least be my assumption. So, like, that makes sense to me. I wouldn't really complain about Google doing that. It's more just the fact that this application didn't handle that sort of input properly.
Yeah.
They do mention that, oh, well, the keyboard doesn't let you enter a new line. But that's, client-based defenses. I mean, you should assume those will be broken.
Yeah. So, like you were saying, Google gave him the classic won't fix, saying it's the developer's responsibility to write applications that are, robust enough to design with that, to deal with that unexpected input. I agree on that. This is, I think we had an issue like this last week, but this is another issue that you can't really pin on Google. It's on the people who are using it. I do want to say though, when he reached out, they said the changes, they did actually make some changes. So even though they said won't fix and they said that it's on the developers, they did actually make some changes in that when he got around to writing the article and tried to reproduce it, he got an alert saying try to avoid using @sys any and use fallback intents. And a capo is no longer interpreted as a new line, but it's interpreted literally. But when he reached out, they said the changes were not made as a result of his report. I feel like that's kind of weird that like those specific issues that he highlighted were fixed, but they told him they won't fix it, but then they were fixed, and they're saying it wasn't because of him.
It
seems
is, but
seems kind of weird.
If it's also like such a short turnaround, I could imagine that they were already planning to add in like a warning about something, or it's definitely possible that this was a bit more of a malicious action on Google's part, where they just don't want payout. But it's not like this would have been a huge payout anyhow. So
yeah,
I wouldn't be
we don't know for sure. It's just something that was like kind of fishy that I saw.
I mean, Google just doesn't have a history of shafting bug reporters. Like, that isn't something Google is known to do. So the fact that this happened, like, if we start seeing more reports of this, I'd be more concerned. But oh no, in this case, I'd want to give Google the benefit of the doubt. As much as we will complain about some things Google does, when it comes to paying out bounties, I haven't heard a lot of complaints about them.
Okay. One thing I did like about the article is they do go into some depth about the dialogue flow stuff, which I thought was kind of cool. I actually had no idea, like, I've never really looked into how the Google Assistant and stuff like that works. This kind of offers some cool insight into that, like this intent system. I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah,
it doesn't go too in depth in it, but at least let you know roughly how it works, which I thought was kind of neat.
Yeah, it's a high level thing. Like, it makes sense in this case. If you want to learn about that, probably wouldn't come to this, but I mean, it's the necessary background to understand the flow of this program, because it isn't like a normal program that you'd write.
So overall, I kind of disagree with the person who wrote the article, but it is still a cool article.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is really Google's issue. I appreciate that they've added in the warning there. And maybe if they clarified whether or not Google would replace other like new line and stuff, they'd replace those things if it was in English, or if this application was in if this application was in Italian and they were just replacing those characters because the person's speaking Italian and they're trying to capture what that person actually wanted to write. Like, if they made that a bit more clear, perhaps I would fault this one on Google. But as I'm making the assumption about some things, and I've been clear about where I'm making assumptions, given those assumptions, it feels like it's not Google's fault, but I could understand why this might be. But yeah, I appreciate that Google's at least added the warning about letting it. I'm assuming the sys any will is kind of the command that will actually overwrite things, like with characters.
Yeah. So, yeah, pretty cool. That was our last topic, though. I'm just checking chat. I don't think there's any questions.
Nope.
But you guys are free to ask any questions on like future podcasts, or if you have a last minute one. But yeah, we are gonna wrap things up.
Or if you have questions, you can jump into our Discord.
Yeah, that too.
We've got that very inactive, but we do watch it.
Yep, for sure. We also have a YouTube channel that has all of the archived videos of past episodes. They're up 24 hours after the stream. So this
as with all the audios, 24 hours from now.
Yeah. So so if you haven't checked those out, feel free to. You can follow us on Twitter for like updates regarding streams and stuff that we're doing on Fridays and stuff like that. Like I said during the episode, we might look at that that sudo issue on stream. I think that would actually be pretty cool. But we'll let you guys know about that on Twitter for those of you who follow us. But that wraps up this podcast. We will see you guys again next Monday at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. And until then, we'll see you then.